And just like that, the greatest partnership in Formula One history comes to an end. What I want to dig into is what made that partnership so special. And I want to look at three main things. First one was, what were Lewis's strengths when he came to Mercedes? What were the driving things that made him so good, so sought after, and so dramatic up until that point, from the moment he came into Formula One to the point at which Mercedes hired him in 2013. But also, what were the things that were drawbacks? What were the vices that Mercedes had to take on about Lewis, and that he had to work on? And by the end of that partnership, I want to have an idea of whether he'd been able to resolve those things, whether he'd been able to take that raw pace, the stuff that made him as good as he was, and had he been able to find some kind of balance with the stuff that didn't work for him quite as well up until that point. Had he made himself the best that he possibly could be? And how are we going to do that? Well, this is mainly through quotes. There's not a lot of data here, but this is quotes from, I think, the people that matter, the engineers, the drivers, people that had access to his data, that could see the magic happening in front of them, but also had to deal with some of the drawbacks, some of the things that didn't make him as good, and then had to help him come to terms with those things to become a better driver. I wanted to not look at those team members that have a huge PR background and are able to really perfect their answers, or are worrying about what somebody else might think. And the reason for doing that is something that Martin Brundle mentioned during the broadcast for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, where he said that during the filming day that he did with Lewis and Mercedes, you should definitely catch that, it's brilliant, where he drove a few of Lewis's old Mercedes Formula One cars. He had a chance to speak to some of the engineers there, Pete Bonington, Ron Meadows, Andrew Shovlin, and he felt like they didn't have that PR filter. They just said what they felt. So the views and the feelings that they had about Lewis, where he'd come from, where he was right now, were pure, unfiltered. There was no PR person, comms expert looking at them, checking that they gave the right answers. And I think that's important. And we're going to look at this hopefully from three different time points. First, to look at where that magic came from, the raw talent. What was it? We're going to look at some of the stuff that was said about him right at the beginning of his career, and we'll have a look at how that fed directly into Lewis coming into Mercedes. We'll do a little midterm report, where within that Mercedes journey did Lewis really start to make the strides, what made the difference, and a little end of term report as well. So what was it that he reached? What was the end product that he was when he left Mercedes? And not all of it is going to be positive, because we all know that he's come off the back of a fairly difficult season. But let's try and get into this a little bit. So let's start right back at the beginning, and we're going to go to this book. This is Mark Hughes, and I've got a lot of Mark Hughes in this. If you listen to this YouTube channel a lot, you'll know that I have a lot of time for Mark Hughes. This is his book about Lewis Hamilton from 2008 and 2009. Lewis Hamilton, the full story. If you haven't read it, go and check it out. It details his entire story from karts right up until the end of the 2007-2008 season. And a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about comes from this. So when Lewis first turned up at McLaren, he'd had a fairly outstanding junior career. And this is something that was written about him by one of the McLaren team members at his first pre-season test in Bahrain in 2007. So he says he will tell you that the balance is changing from neutral to oversteer, but then says, it's okay, I can drive around it. I'm just letting you know. And when you look at his times, he's still just as fast. Now, why is that important? Well, you have to understand that when we talk about rear instability now. It's become much more normalised, and it's something I'll come back to a bit later. But in 2007, remember that the last driver that had been really comfortable with a dodgy rear end was Michael Schumacher, who had retired the season before. And the benchmark at that time was a guy that was now a 2-time world champion, Fernando Alonso. His way of driving the car was based on what he had learned at Renault, driving Michelin tyres, and that car wanted a much more easy, livable balance, something that was a bit more biddable by the driver. But it meant that the front end of the car often washed wide. He put a lot of energy into the front end of the car and asked a lot of it, whereas, as we now know, Lewis's driving style asks a lot more of the rear end of the car. It's something that I've talked about in this channel quite a few times over the last season, given his troubles. But why is an oversteery car important? Why does it help? Well, there's 2 types of corner in Formula 1. There's fast corners and there's slow corners. The fast corners, in general, you can put your foot down and you get around them. The downforce of the car allows you to go around them. So the difference that a driver makes is really in the slower corners. But the car wants 2 different things in those 2 different kinds of corners. In the faster corner, the car wants to oversteer. So what you want to do is build in a bit of understeer to give the driver a bit more confidence in those corners. But in the slower corners, the car just wants to understeer, wants to wash wide and not turn in sharply, which is what you as a driver want the car to do. But if you have built in a huge amount of understeer because you need confidence in the fast corners, then that's then going to cause you problems in the slower corners, because the understeer balance is going to make your car not want to go around the corner as easily. But if you can live with a more flighty or a bit more of an unstable, loose rear end in the faster corners, you then have a more positive front end and a bit of a looser rear end for the slower corners, which means you can pivot the car a bit more easily. It's why back in 2008 and 2009, when Lewis first went to Abu Dhabi, for example, the description was of him treating his car like a go-kart through the final sector of the circuit, in the same way that Max Verstappen does now around Monaco. So having that loose rear end, or at least being comfortable with rear instability, paid you back in lap time in 2007 at a time when it was quite unique to be doing that. And that's borne out by the fact that other drivers weren't doing that and weren't even able to understand how Lewis was able to get those times. So this is Nico Rosberg, actually just before Abu Dhabi, but remember that Nico and Lewis were in the same car in the early part of Lewis's Mercedes career, so I think this is relevant. He said that he has maybe the greatest natural talent the sport has ever seen. There's so many occasions where we have the same car, we go out, we come in, and you look at the data, what he's done with that car, and it's just like, that's not even human. And you have to look at that in the context of him driving that unstable rear end that other drivers just weren't able to cope with. And Nico, I think, was one of those drivers as well that really needed to have a positive front end, but needed a bit more understeer for stability in the faster corners, and just wasn't able to do the things that Lewis was able to do. And he's not the only one. This is Jenson Button via Motorsport magazine. And he wrote a little memo to his dad saying if ever Lewis works out how to get the best from himself and the engineers, the rest of us might as well go home. That's another reference to him being able to do things with the car that other people were just not able to do. That was Jenson talking in 2012 when they were teammates. And it's not just other drivers, even his engineers. This is Paddy Lowe talking again to Mark Hughes, recognising what Lewis was able to do in the car that other drivers just couldn't. So Paddy Lowe was the technical director at Mercedes-Benz when Lewis arrived, but he'd also seen him right at the beginning of his career at McLaren in 2006. And this is what he said: the first time we ran him at McLaren, I recall the guys looking at the steering traces at the Silverstone test. The oversteer corrections in all the braking zones and corner entries were massive. We were waiting for him and he didn't mention that. We asked, how is the car on entry? And he said, fine. His natural car control was extraordinary. Most drivers would have been quite unhappy with such instability. That's from an article which Mark Hughes wrote right at the beginning of Lewis's Mercedes career, and I really wanted to say thank you to Supercat22, who's one of our users. Howdy, mate. You put us on to this article. Here it is. It's called Decoding the Enigma. You can find that in Motorsport magazine. And it's from this article that we find some of the drawbacks, some of the things that were holding Lewis back at that time, the things that needed work. And the main thing was what was perceived to be his mental instability, that he let outside influences affect his driving adversely too often. You look at his 2011 season, all of the stuff that was going on in his personal life meant that was, up until that point, by far the worst season he had performance-wise, and it led to him being beaten in the points by his teammate Jenson Button. You'll remember during that season that he was talking about building himself a personal bubble and how he was going to make sure he kept all the demons out. Well, all of that wasn't done particularly successfully at times, and yet he was still able to out-qualify Jenson over the course of that 2011 season, and sometimes put in otherworldly performances. And although I said I wasn't going to use pundit quotes, this one is quite pertinent, I think. This is Mark Hughes in that article. He says, yes, that will over time prevent him converting all of his talent into results, but the emotion is also what fuels many of his performances. You cannot have one without the other. What Mark is trying to say there is that you get the raw pace from Lewis, but he can't access that without having the emotion to drive it. But sometimes that emotion also adversely affects him. That really was the challenge, and it's borne out a little bit, at least, by what the team found when they were working with him. This is again Paddy Lowe during that season. He says he's very quick to recognize his failings. Then after you've dealt with it, he says, yeah, but you will still need to help me with this because I'll do it again. And there's a clear sense that I've got that talent, but I've got this stuff around me. I will say things or do things that will not help me in the heat of battle. How do I get myself out of those things? So this is where we're going to come to the point in Lewis's Mercedes career where that started to be turned on its head, because there's a clear problem here that you've got Lewis unique in terms of the way that he derives pace from his car at that time, being able to do things with the car that other drivers were just not able to do. Drivers, engineers were looking at his data thinking, how the heck did he just do that? But coupled to that was perhaps this potential to allow outside influences to get in the way, to prevent him from, as Mark Hughes puts it, reach the potential, get the results that potential should allow him to achieve. We're going to look at another article. This one is from Autosport, from Matt Q in 2021. It's called The Bleak Reality for Those Trying to Topple Hamilton Inside Mercedes. And in it, he's trying to understand why Valtteri Bottas in 2020 and 2021 was having such a difficult time getting to terms with Lewis Hamilton. And there's something about his battle with Nico Rosberg that meant that all of the unresolved stuff that he came to Mercedes with was allowed to find its head, and he was able to find a way out of that. This is Tony Ross, who was Nico Rosberg's race engineer at Mercedes-Benz. And he says, I think at that stage, between 2013 to 2016, Nico and Lewis were not that dissimilar in terms of performance, but they were very different drivers in their approach. Lewis is much more of a natural driver. Again, that talent, he's got this raw talent that allows him to be able to do things with the car that other drivers just cannot do. Nico is someone who is able to learn a lot. He could, on the right day, sometimes beat Lewis. But that was never going to be enough. Lewis needed to be able to temper that, to bring those two things together. So what does Tony Ross say happened next? So this is Tony Ross talking in 2020, he says if you look at Lewis, he has progressed massively. 2020 version of Lewis. He's not the same driver who joined Mercedes in 2013. He's grown a lot as he has learned so much more. But where did that learning come from? This is it for me anyway. Between him and Nico, they were learning off each other all the time. They were just ramping up their ability, and the team was learning a lot as well. That gives us part of the reason, at least, that between 2013 and 2016, Lewis got the challenge he absolutely needed. The challenge from the driver inside his team that had been there before, that had built up a relationship, and on his day could be just as quick. And I think especially that 2016 season, that mentality of having to win every single race, the need to show that he was quicker and faster than everybody else at every opportunity melted away a little bit, giving rise to this idea that actually the most important thing was the bigger picture, and that was really what made Lewis unbeatable by his teammate within his own team between the end of 2016 when Nico upped and retired and 2020-2021 when Valtteri Bottas left. Bottas trying to do what Nico Rosberg did just wasn't going to be able to do it. Him trying to do things on his own terms was also not going to be able to do. He just didn't have the latent talent to be able to do that, or the mentality, or the team behind him at that time to be able to make that happen for him. Lewis had just built everything around him. He'd learned so much from that time, and he'd finally become the driver that I think Mercedes had hoped he would become over the course of their time together. So much so that in 2024, June of this year, James Allison, when speaking to Tom Clarkson in the Beyond the Grid podcast, was asked to compare Schumacher, whom he had worked with at Ferrari, and Lewis. And he said, look, gun against the head, if I had to choose the best person, I would pick Lewis. And if you think that that's just hyperbole, have a think about why that has happened. Why is it that James Allison might say that? To answer that question, let's go back to Andrew Shovlin and his interview with Tom Clarkson in the Beyond the Grid one podcast that came out only last week, I think. And he said, when asked, was Lewis a raw, rough diamond when he turned up in 2013, Andrew Shovlin said yes, in the sense that every year he was with this team, he would go away for the winter, he had a great awareness of what he could improve in himself, and he would come back in January a stronger driver. So could you say he was the most rounded driver in year one? Well, probably not, because, and this is important, over the years he was just getting better and better. When he won another championship, he didn't go out and enjoy himself over the winter. There would be such a focus on where he could find the next step. And that next step was in so many different areas, not just his own performance in trying to get more out of himself in the car, but also how he could make the technical team work for him. There's a really brilliant story from the Beyond the Grid podcast back in 2021. They did an article or a podcast called The Brackley Boys. You should definitely go and check it out. A lot of you will have watched that and heard them swoon over Michael Schumacher coming into their team. But there was something in there that was really important. In 2020, Mercedes had the long wheelbase W11. And that car inherently didn't want to turn into corners. So Lewis had asked for the rear suspension to be changed to give the car a more positive rear end and to loosen up the rear end to get it to turn into corners a bit better. Maybe that didn't really help Valtteri Bottas, but it certainly helped him. And that was him making a specific technical request to the team based on what he could feel in the car. That helped him get better. It gave him that dominant performance that he had. So to try and say that Lewis was only good because of the car, well, yeah, those two things come together. Every driver, be it Lando Norris at McLaren or Max Verstappen at Red Bull, is always trying to create the greatest synergy that they can between themselves and the machine. And if you have an insight into the technical makeup of your car, what makes it go fast, what makes you go fast in it, that is the key. And that is what Lewis was able to do. Once he was able to understand what it was that he needed to get out of himself week in and week out. And it seemed to finally culminate for Chauvelin anyway in the Brazilian Grand Prix in 2021. He said he was added to a WhatsApp group created by Lewis called We Will Do This. Brilliant. I love that. He said he's got this sense of belief that's so strong it could almost make things happen. The dedication, the commitment, the level of detail he was going into to make sure we could go and win 4 races on the bounce. And that's not just him trying to drive the car fast. As I say, it was him trying to make technical suggestions as well, not as an engineer but as a driver. This is what I need from the car. Can you do this for me? Can you make the car do this? And the engineers would see that as a problem, and they did create the car that he needed, not just from a power unit point of view. Yes, that was important, but the fact that they were able to make a car that was as biddable and drivable for him, that he could raise the ceiling with, as I keep saying, week in, week out, allowed him to have the performances that he had towards the end of 2021. So the final thing that I just want to touch on, and this is really just me spitballing, but it's why is it that a driver that had such a unique talent in 2007 was so down in the dumps in 2024? And I think if you look at Lewis's career and you look at the trajectory of other drivers on the grid, it makes much more sense when you look at what he came with and what he has had right up until 2021. I don't think you lose things over just the last 2 or 3 seasons. It's not an age thing. It's the fact that what was unique in 2007 seems to be much more common now. Just like at that point, what he was bringing was completely different. What somebody like Max is able to do now, to be able to live with that rear end, has taken that to another level. And drivers like George Russell and Charles Leclerc are doing the same thing with their cars. That's just the norm now. So Lewis's unique style has been adopted by people coming through. That, you know, he's clearly had a direct influence on that. But he's now reached a threshold where his own driving style actually is his comfort with the rear end of the car has reached a threshold beyond which even his driving style is not comfortable. And other drivers have come along and are more comfortable with it. And that, for me, really is the problem that Lewis has run into in 2024, and something that, if he's able to continue to do what he has done over the course of all of his seasons at Mercedes, taking the weaknesses, going deep within himself over the winters and working out what needs to be done, if he can do that over the winter of 2024 into 2025, then perhaps we'll have back the driver that Mercedes-Benz loved as much as they did, their talisman for the last 12 seasons. And there you go. That's what I have to say about that. As usual, if you like what we're doing here, please like, please subscribe, please leave us a comment. We'll read every single one and we will reply to as many as we possibly can. This for me was a bit of a labour of love. Lewis is my favourite driver. He may not be necessarily the best driver on the grid right now, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something to learn from how he has approached his career. We will see you guys in the next one.